All right, let's dive right into this explainer. Today, we're putting on our historian's glasses to re-examine the legendary colonial city of Potosi. Now, if you know anything at all about the Spanish colonial era in the Andes, the name Potosi immediately conjures up a very specific and, frankly, a very dark image. High up in modern-day Bolivia, we're talking over 13,000 feet above sea level, this was the site of the absolute most massive silver rush in history. At its peak, this incredibly remote mountain settlement exploded in population until it literally rivaled London in size. But today we aren't just looking at the silver. We're looking at the people who were forced to extract it, and how they somehow managed to carve out a space for themselves with an incredibly oppressive system.
So what happens when we look past pure victimhood? You know, when we approach history purely as a story of the oppressors and the oppressed, we often accidentally erase the humanity, the ingenuity, and the active decision-making of the victims. But by looking past those shadows, we discover a remarkable story of human resilience. For this classroom lecture, we're going to examine this city from the perspective of an historian studying cultural syncretism, which is just a fancy way of saying the active blending of vastly different cultures. We want to see how individuals adapted when their entire world was completely turned upside down.
We traditionally know Potosi for its brutal exploitation, right? It's a narrative so dark it was being called out as early as 1550. Just consider the sheer human cost of the silver that flooded Europe. The Spanish crown was absolutely desperate for this wealth to fund their global empire and their endless wars. I mean, the silver pulled from this region literally created the first global currency, the peso of 8. But as Friar Domingo de Santo Tomas warned the Council of the Indies, that immense global wealth was paid for directly with the blood, sweat, and lives of the indigenous Andean peoples.
And the physical landscape perfectly captures this. Looming right over the city is the Cerro Rico, the Rich Hill. It acts as this massive physical shadow over Potosi, perfectly mirroring the metaphorical shadow of oppression. Tens of thousands of indigenous workers were forced into grueling, often fatal labor deep inside that mountain. The physical conditions were, well, they were absolutely hellish. Miners crawled through cramped, pitch-black shafts prone to sudden collapses, breathing in toxic dust and suffocating heat for days at a time. It's a haunting reality, for sure. But to fully understand Potosi, we have to contrast this shadow with what was happening down below in the city streets.
This brings us to a really crucial point. We have to contrast the traditional Black legend of absolute victimhood with the new historical lens of cultural syncretism. The Black legend focuses almost entirely on total Spanish domination, basically painting the native population as entirely helpless. But cultural syncretism asks us to look a little closer at how indigenous people actively adapted to survive. They weren't just passive cogs in a massive colonial machine, they were active economic actors. They were maneuvering through a brand new, complex, and incredibly diverse urban environment to carve out their very own opportunities.
Let's trace how this all developed, because things weren't actually always so strictly regulated. When silver was first discovered back in 1545, the situation was kind of like a chaotic free-for-all. The Spanish essentially didn't fully understand the high-altitude environment or how to best extract the silver from that stubborn ore. For the first 27 years, indigenous workers actually held a significant amount of leverage. But everything changed drastically in the late 16th century when Viceroy Francisco de Toledo arrived in Peru with a strict mandate to maximize profits at absolutely any cost.
In those early days before Toledo showed up, a specific group of indigenous workers known as Yanacona actually held immense economic power. They possessed the traditional, highly specialized knowledge to smelt ore using these really clever wind-powered ovens called guairas. Traditional European smelting techniques completely failed at such extreme, oxygen-deprived altitudes. So, because the Spanish couldn't refine the silver without them, the Yanaconas essentially held a total monopoly. Many made the calculated personal choice to migrate to Potosi, acting as independent contractors and navigating the boomtown system for their own profit.
But Toledo's reforms in the 1570s? They shattered that early autonomy. He plunged the indigenous population into a deadly new system by introducing a process of mercury amalgamation to refine the lower-grade silver ore that was now dominating the mountain. This completely destroyed the Yanacona smelting monopoly literally overnight. Suddenly, indigenous expertise wasn't needed anymore. The Spanish just needed cheap, expendable labor to crush the rock and mix it with highly toxic mercury. The identity of the indigenous worker was violently shifted from an independent artisan to a forced labor.
And to secure that vast pool of cheap labor, Toledo weaponized the traditional Andean concept of the mita. Now, the Incan mita was originally a reciprocal labor draft intended for community projects. Toledo completely distorted it into a massive forced migration. He required 16 provinces to send a percentage of their able-bodied men to Potosi every single year, forcing them to work in the mines for a fraction of a living wage.
Beyond the physical dangers of cave-ins, they now face the horrific realities of mercury poisoning, suffering severe neurological tremors, tooth loss, and agonizing physical decay. Let's make this real. Think about the story of a specific migrant, someone we can call Amaru, just to understand this profound shock. One day, Amaru is living in a quiet, traditional agricultural community, an Ailu, working the land according to the seasons. The very next day, he's uprooted, forced to march hundreds of miles, and suddenly thrust into the massive, terrifying, toxic colonial machine of Potosi. Actually, this rapid shift from rural traditions to a desperate industrialized urban struggle directly mirrors the shock experienced centuries later by workers leaving the English countryside for the smog-choked factories of Birmingham during the Industrial Revolution. It was a total upending of their entire way of life. But wait, let's step out of the dark mines for a second and pivot to the vibrant heart of the city. While the mines represented systemic oppression, the marketplace was a different story entirely. The modern Mercado Central in Potosi still beautifully echoes the historical Plaza del Gato, or Market of the Cat. With the grueling mita system largely locking indigenous workers out of the direct mining profits, the city's marketplace became the primary arena where they could forge alternative opportunities and actually reclaim some control over their lives. When you put Potosi's market side by side with other major regional colonial centers, the contrast is absolutely staggering. Observers at the time, like the Spanish traveler Cieza de León, noted that compared to traditional cities like Cusco, Potosi's market was overwhelmingly larger and far more dynamic. Because of the massive, constant influx of population drafted by the Mita, the sheer volume of goods flowing into the city was unmatched, which surprisingly drove local prices down. And crucially, this massive economic engine was largely indigenous-led, totally defying Spanish attempts at control.
We actually have this incredible quote from the colonial chronicler Bartolomé Arzães de Urzúa y Vela that really captures the awe Europeans felt when walking through these bustling markets. It paints a vivid picture of a space where indigenous resilience thrived. Amidst the horrors of the Mita, they didn't just barely survive, they actively commanded the urban economy. The markets were overflowing with everything, from basic regional produce to high-end luxury goods, including fine imported silks, exotic spices, and intricate jewelry, all traded vigorously by native merchants. To understand the true scale of this parallel economy, consider this number: 40,000. Contemporary accounts estimated that on incredibly busy market days, up to 40,000 pesos of gold in goods were traded exclusively among the indigenous population in the Plaza del Gato. That is a staggering amount of independent circulating wealth moving entirely outside the direct control and surveillance of the Spanish crown. It represents a completely incredible level of economic sophistication and defiance happening right in the shadow of the mountain.
They even found ingenious ways to siphon wealth directly back from the mountain through a practice known as the rescate trade. This was a highly subversive, untaxed, and completely illegal economic network. Indigenous miners would intentionally smuggle out high-quality chunks of silver ore or mine it secretly during their very limited time off on the weekends, and then trade it in the city's markets. It was a brilliant, calculated hustle to bypass Spanish colonial taxation completely and reclaim the wealth of their own land.
And if we look at the population demographics by 1611, they tell a fascinating story of a booming metropolis. Out of roughly 160,000 people, the indigenous population made up the vast majority at over 76,000. But they were rubbing shoulders with tens of thousands of Europeans who weren't Spanish, along with Creoles and thousands of Africans. Potosi was a true cultural confluence, a chaotic melting pot. The marketplace was the central hub where all these diverse groups collided, traded, learned from one another, and inevitably influenced each other's cultures. In this bustling hub, indigenous people actively forged new, complex identities through cultural syncretism. They brilliantly blended ancient Incan traditions with Spanish capitalist models. They seamlessly moved from a traditional Incan barter system to a complex, multi-layered network that utilized silver coins, food commodities, and even European-style credit. They took deeply traditional religious items like the sacred coca leaf and brilliantly commercialized them in massive bulk to meet the insatiable urban demand of exhausted miners. They learned to play the European capitalist game, but on their own terms. Perhaps the most fascinating social shift of all was how indigenous women stepped up to become massive economic powerhouses. While many men were trapped in the horrific, deadly conditions of the Mita inside the mountain, indigenous women took over the administration of the market stalls. They controlled the daily transactions and amassed significant independent personal wealth.
In an incredible subversion of colonial power, these women often generated enough cash to single-handedly pay off the crushing colonial tribute debts for their rural home communities. They were effectively buying their villages freedom and gaining unprecedented financial independence from men. So we are left with the tale of a truly dual city, making it a perfect subject for our classroom comparison. Like the later industrial labor struggles in Birmingham we talked about earlier, Potosi was defined by an incredible daily tension. On one hand, you have the mine, a space of systemic oppression, forced me to labor, and a desperate daily struggle for physical survival. But operating directly alongside it is the market, a space defined by subversive choices, calculated cultural adaptation, and newfound economic opportunity. They were two radically different worlds existing within the exact same city limits.
I'm going to leave you with this provocative thought to chew on. Does acknowledging the brilliant economic agency of the indigenous people diminish the reality of their exploitation, or does it finally restore their full humanity? When we acknowledge that these workers weren't just victims, but also shrewd traders, community protectors, and adaptable survivors, we aren't erasing the horrors of colonialism. Instead, we're giving them back their three-dimensional humanity. Thank you so much for joining this explainer. Keep questioning the shadows of history, and I'll see you next time.